Sophia is a gender equality and humanitarian leader with over a decade of experience advancing gender transformative, climate resilient programs in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Currently with World Vision Canada. A published author and TEDx speaker with a PhD in social justice education, she partners with Nordic and bilateral donors to advance women, peace, and security and rights-based development. Sophia, welcome to the Future Makers podcast.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.
Of course. We have a lot to catch up on. I think the last time we actually met each other in person, it was maybe a decade ago.
I think it was a little bit under. No, it was a decade.
Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah. Amazing.
Okay. So we have a lot to talk about today.
Tons to catch up on.
But let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
So I always ask this question to my interviewees, and I started with a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Kierkegaard. And I think I'm just butchering his name, and I've been butchering it for the last 8 interviews. Okay. So never mind. So Kierkegaard says, we live life forwards, but understand it backwards. How does that apply to your life? How do you see your early life kind of affecting how the person you are today?
Well, when you shared the quote with me previously, I thought, wow, I mean, I had to take several steps back and really think about, what could I intentionally share with you? So when looking back now, what really stands out is how early on, let's say, I learned to live in the in-between. So from a young age, I was carrying questions that didn't have simple answers, like, where are you from, or where are you really from, or which part of you matters here? At the time, I didn't have the language, or let's say the sociological, academic, scholarly language to understand it, but I was already learning that identity is negotiated and not actually a given. And that process of constantly piecing myself together across cultures and languages and histories and countries trained me to pay attention to the nuance. And some folks, and especially my husband, would say, well, you're just so sensitive. But it's incredible because that sensitivity has been a gift. I learned to read rooms, to listen before speaking, to understand that context shapes everything, detail shapes everything. And those early experiences within my childhood or formative years quietly prepared me for the work where the in-between is actually or exactly where the real work is happening. So between policy and people, between intention and impact, between power and agency and lived experience. I think that's all. Yeah.
I mean, talking on the subject of in between, what were the kind of physical spaces you were growing up in? I assume they were also in between.
Sure. So I was raised, at the time, I have to say, I didn't come in contact with this term until I was in my PhD coursework. So it's a pretty incredible period of time. But I was raised as a third culture kid. And so as a third culture kid, I'm being raised outside of my parents' country of origin, right? So a TCK, they call them. And so I have parents that are originally born in Cyprus, identify as Greek Cypriot. I was born in Athens, and less than a month later, we were based, because of my father's professional life, in Dominican Republic. And then from Dominican Republic, I spent those early childhood years into my early teens in Ghana in West Africa, and then immigrating to Canada. So from the start, I think that not only were we moving, and of course Cyprus, where we would visit the extended family, and our grandparents and my parents were very much tied to their country of origin. So there was a lot of movement, and what was interesting wasn't the arrival into place or country, it was the in-between prior. So things like memory or what I expected a place to look like or to be, and that feeling, and in between all those spaces or contexts was very different.
Tell me about the different cultures you were kind of growing up in. What was the script that was being fed to you during in the various cultures?
So I remember being quite young at the time and asked repeatedly, "Where are you from?" And I'd pause because there wasn't a version of the answer that quite fit neatly into one sentence. So every response required the context and the explanation and a story behind it. And even to this day, being based in Nicosia in Cyprus now for the last almost 11 years, it's the same script. So even as a child, I realized that some people belong easily and others like me belonged in a narrative, and through an explanation. And that stayed with me. I learned that, early on in life that some of us are shaped by their roots. So ROUTS, the roots that we take, rather than roots, ROOTS, right? The roots, like a plant. So you're constantly, at least I feel like I'm constantly translating language, not just in the nuances of the way language is spoken and words are said, and also depending on where I am, I adapt, I observe, I listen. And yeah, I think, that has played a key role in the so-called script, which really feels unscripted in many ways.
And who were the women on that route, that early route of yours?
The women, gosh. It's interesting. I found my mother played a key role in that time. Partly because she lived in the in-between, but she also very much lived in the past and the memory and trauma of conflict, and having lived through 74, having lived through this all the way, I think very much prior to 74 in the 60s as well. And her narrative around, immigrant and immigration and movement served as, in many ways, I couldn't understand it then, but I understand it now. I think before I wanted so much to fit into one place, especially as a teenager, living in Niagara Falls, Ontario, in Canada, and trying to sort of fit somewhere. I very much pushed back on her narratives. But now I can see how much that has shaped who I am today and how I understand the world. So, I mean, I've written about inherited cultural threads. So like my mother's memories, but also what she did. She was an artist, and she was an African bead collector, and she put together necklaces and various jewelry, and each of those beads served as a symbol for someone else, African culture, and again, those roots versus roots as well, memory, resilience, continuity. And I'm thinking of other women around me. They didn't always mentor through instruction. They mentored through their presence, through their lived experiences, and I'm very grateful for that. I have an incredible friend of my mother's named Francesca, who I can't mention without getting emotional, who created a space where I could also engage in humor and bringing humor to difficult situations and challenges, which I try to hold on to as well. So, but I have to say, I've also felt the absence of women in certain spaces, and that absence has taught me how power is reproduces itself, how it's shaped, how the intention of how at least we mentor each other. So it's less about, it's less about who's mentoring you, but more what are those roles? What are their absences? What's the role in those spaces?
Yeah. You mentioned that you were kind of pushing back from taking in your mother's narratives, but then you went to study, I guess, conflict and gender, and those, looking back now, those seem very much connected. How did you kind of choose that path? What led you to those choices in your education?
It's interesting because I didn't, that's not the route I wanted to go. I wanted to go into fine art.
Yeah.
And as immigrant parents usually do, they guide you to focus on studies that are stable or deemed stable, right? Which now in this present time is, I don't think anything is really. But I was very curious to understand, especially when I'll circle back. I took a social anthropology course at York University in Toronto. That's where I did my undergrad. And I was inspired by Margaret Mead and her, I understand that anthropology has a very, important and also disturbing connection to colonialism. So we can sort of be clear on that. But I found it interesting in the way she understood, observed, but also participated in culture and how she understood culture. And that in and of itself inspired me to continue that journey on understanding oneself, but others, why they do what they do, not just where they live and how that particular context shapes them, but what are the narratives and the situations or lived experiences of those specifically women. And then, of course, working at the intersection of gender, peace, and policy showed me that power, for example, isn't just held by titles. It's shaped by narratives, who gets to define what matters and whose labor is visible, who speaks for whom and under what conditions. And so I became acutely aware of, as I went on with my studies, who is doing the emotional work, who is doing the care, the unpaid expertise. So I think that's been part of my journey, really, as I went on to study.
Now that we're talking about power, let's talk about your first job, which is usually where a lot of people kind of, there's something about reading theoretically about like gender imbalance and the imbalance of power, but when you actually get to feel it and experience it, and that I find from the conversations I've been having that usually happens in the first professional environment. Is that something that happened in your experience?
Interestingly enough, so one thing I can't quite identify specifically one episode or experience, and so I've been sort of pulling it together. So one thing I still take time to observe is not what's being done, but what's being unseen. So I'll bring it. So for example, I'll bring it into a room. I refuse to let's say, I'm very much aware of women's labor, how it gets normalized, how it gets erased. So in my own writing, in my own scholarly work, I've reflected on the mental load and invisible labor. Also in my day-to-day work and projects as well. So not just domestic concepts or ideas, but also political ones, who's in the room and who's left out. So whether it's care work at home or coordination, at work or institutions or universities, the pattern seems to be the same. Systems rely on it. We don't reward. It's not rewarded. So early in my career, I saw how easily help could become performative. how someone stepping in briefly, visibly, without actually taking responsibility, which was interesting. So what I deliberately do now is I'm very much committed to accountability and transparency. So I don't accept symbolic gestures in place of structural shifts. So that lesson is responsibility and ownership as well.
Can you just define the two? Symbolic versus actual institutional change, or how would you differentiate the two?
I mean, so for example, in our projects, So we're in my daily work with my employer, World Vision. So we have donor funded projects in various countries around the world, and one of the most common things by donors is work with one of their mandatory sort of obligations within the project for funding considerations would be work with women's rights organizations, work with women's groups, work with women. But if you're not providing, or first of all, identifying that women have a variety of unpaid or invisible, identifying the invisible labor in the room or in that space or in the communities where women are responsible for the majority of childcare, they are responsible for elderly care and other duties that are not necessarily identified. How would we expect them to participate in whether it's a leadership program or an economic empowerment program or project, or even take the time to engage in women's rights organizations? We need to have those systems in place that allow women the space to be able to do those things as well. So that's sort of a quick synopsis of.
I'd like to ask you about your PhD. What was the subject?
So my PhD was on women's organizations for peace, and the case study was Cyprus, or the context was Cyprus. I had taken into account 3 very special women's organizations that, and of course, that doesn't exclude other organizations. I think in retrospect, it would have nice to have done more, but in that particular, in the structure of the PhD, I chose those 3 to conduct a deep dive and figure out, how they came to be, who were the key, let's say, activists in those groups, how did they engage with peace building, and really to understand the context of women's movements on the island, but also in the context of transnational feminist theory. So that was sort of the idea behind it. And of course, once you're done and once the PhD is done and dusted and it's published, you think of all the other additional pieces, as the island is so dynamic in terms of activism and peace building. But so that was the focus.
So what would you say is kind of the landscape of women's movements now in Cyprus, especially in relation to peace building? And I guess peace building in various contexts, not just within like the conflict, which is I think the wider problem, but in various micro problems.
I think it's interesting because, we have sort of the formal organizations, and of course, because, the island is small, so you have sort of, and especially within a particular kind of, let's say, ideology or theory around peace building, you may have the same people in the same organizations and groups and so on. But even though there are formal organizations, I'd say, but I'm also also interested in sort of the informal ways women engage, and especially young women and youth engage, because it's not just about peace building. There's something else. So I'm thinking of like climate change, for example, the LGBTQI plus community. So there's sort of the intersectional lens, class issues that are also disability as well, or we very much are an ableist culture. So I'm thinking of sort of that intersectional piece around women's organizations or women's rights groups, also within those informal spaces that are addressing those intersectional pieces.
And what is the value of women or various minority groups of coming together for these to challenge, the norm, the stereotypes? Do you think activists can work on their own independently, or do we need this group setting?
This is an interesting question for me, because over the years, and of course, after the PhD was published and I started working full time and remotely, which meant the time difference has been quite challenging, but also realizing that time is limited and my band didn't have as much bandwidth to engage. But I'm still observing sort of from a distance in many ways. But the thing is that, yes, there is value as long as we don't continue to work in silos. And so one of the things that I have observed is, even though there's formal, let's say, committees that are part of the peace process, like the Gender Technical Committee and other coalitions or, teams or groups, etc. I think whether they're working in human trafficking, whether they're working on disability, on women's rights, etc., and within the so-called formal peace process, as long as we don't work in silos. There's so many pieces. So I think one of the sort of frustrations for me over the years, post PhD and post publications and post participant, as an active participant, has been stop working in silos and come together. And they do in some ways, but I think you sort of see the same topics or themes and engagement, but that is separate from each other. And I think that's sort of one of the things I would like to see being done more of. So that intersectional piece. So when we're talking about women's rights, who are we talking about? When we talk about peace building on the island, or whose peace are we discussing, right? And as we know, peace for women means different things. So I'm very much aware of that. But there is, I'm sorry, it's just to circle back, there is value in coming together and creating a social cohesive movement. But that takes a lot of work. Yeah.
Do you think we've made progress in the last decade with the women's movement, with women's rights here? And I'm talking about the context of Cyprus.
Definitely, for sure. I think we have. It hasn't been as dynamic as I think I was expecting it to be, especially working in countries outside of Cyprus. My portfolio from Afghanistan to Lebanon to Turkey to Syria to Tanzania, Mozambique, and also other West African and South Africa, etc. The women's groups and movements, for example, in Sudan is much more dynamic, or in Liberia. There's a certain, but that's not part of the culture here, I think, as well. And I think you only sort of understand that when your rights are under threat. And that's where I think that's sort of that piece that I don't necessarily see, that sort of the dynamic piece. But that's not to say that there's no progress. I think most women's rights activists and groups would say, yes, we have made progress, et cetera, and we are improving. But it's a different kind of dynamic there.
Yeah, it's a lot quieter.
It's quieter, and I think also classist based. I think the disability movement feels missing to me.
Yeah.
In some ways. Yeah. But it's not to erase the work that's being done, I have to say. It doesn't mean that the work is not important and that the work is not of value.
But it does mean we still have a lot of work to do, just in terms of like the legal framework and the cultural script, even though I keep returning to the word. But like
sure.
I want to talk about failure. Yeah. Is there a specific personal failure that you keep, that maybe you still think about?
Oh, I mean, have I failed? All the time. More times than I'd like to, more times than I'd like to share publicly. There were moments when I believed in, whether it was projects or jobs that I believed in deeply, and they simply just didn't move forward or they collapsed. And, there were, very well researched, thoughtfully designed, projects, and then they were stalled because of security issues and risk, or they weren't awarded, for example. And you're just like, what? How is that possible? It was the most innovative written proposal that we could ever have submitted. And, obviously I take there's some proposals or projects that I feel very much emotionally invested in. So I tend to beat myself up saying, like, I hadn't argued well enough. I didn't push hard enough. And so that has been challenging to kind of reconcile in many ways. But I have to say, that being said, I've recently in my writing have explored how interruptions in life, so things like grief or loss, stall the momentum of what have just shared with you, those moments of failure where you're like, I could have done this, or I could have done that, it could have been better. And so what I've realized over time, when I had to say no to a role that was presented to me, or I had to say no to an incredibly popular or panel discussion at the UN in New York, or whatever it was at the time. I can't, there have been so many different opportunities to speak, and I couldn't do it. Because of other personal reasons. And I realized that in those pauses where I couldn't make it, or in those spaces, it was a signal. So there's been time where I've been ill, I've been struggling with health issues, or it's been addressing grief, or whether it's mental health, and I've been trying to reframe it. That failure is actually a signal that systems move at their own pace, that politics matters, timing matters, specifically more timing. So reframing failure to look at it as a way of being less reactive, more patient, more attentive, and really digging deep now of where the resistance was coming from. What am I trying to protect in the reaction of feeling like I failed? And really, it's helped me sharpen. In some ways, it's not perfect. It's still a work in progress of how to address failure as not as something negative, but something that's meant to happen as a pause or a reset.
It's a lovely way to say it. That's a really poignant definition for failure. How would you then define success? You've talked a lot now. You've just mentioned quite a few failures. What would deem as failures within a career progression, accepting panel, accepting to be part of exceptional panels. So how would you then deem success in terms of in relation to your definition of failure?
That's really, success looked very different in my 30s than it does now in my late 40s. Success can make you feel invincible. It can carry you on a high for weeks and weeks. And then, the trick is into believing that you can see the road in front of you, that it's very clear that you, so failure taught me something a little bit more useful than success is how to hold multiple truths at once. So that success is not linear, that disappointment can be part of your success, that failure can be part of your success. There have been so many windows and doors shut, or opportunities where I wasn't included. You know, it's interesting. Sometimes I think as people, we want to be seen, we want to be heard. And when you don't feel heard, that may be somewhat of a failure to you. So I think for me, both success and failure has been quite humbling. Because as you're reading my bio, and it sounds quite incredible to me, I don't even recognize who that person is because it has been so much work. There has been so much failure to get to all of that, what we in society would deem successful. So, I mean, I almost am tempted to rewrite the bio to share some of the struggles and failures, so to speak, to share with folks that the road is not linear. It will be messy. It can be messy, and messy is okay. And to pay attention to nuance. I think that's the real currency of success and failure. So I don't think one can exist without the other. Success gives you confidence. Failure gives you the depth. So they come together or have come together for me. Yeah.
Has your experience of the two changed any relationships in your life?
Oh, yeah. Yes, it very much has. So how do I put this? It's clarified for me, or it's kind of been insightful of who was invested in the work itself versus the outcome. So things like visibility, recognition, timelines, that distinction matters to me. So I've written about how relationships evolve over time. So they're not just harmonious. Obviously, they come with various challenges. And I think that, I think for me, the most poignant part was after my mom passed away and how those relationships evolved and changed, both professionally and personally. And one of I can give you an example, is the vulnerability that grief brings. And I think if you allow yourself to be vulnerable, at least for me, what it's done over the years has brought people in that I wouldn't have necessarily met or talked to had it not been for the grief in my life. So I think the relationships for me now is more based around the intention. What's the real intention here? Why am I spending time with a person, or whether it's personal or professional? I'm more honest or transparent, less performative, I would say.
Which is, I think there's a lot of talk nowadays about being authenticity. And I think I am glad to see that there is a cultural movement towards more living more authentically, even though I hate hearing that phrase. It just, it gives me goosebumps. But there is something to it about being able to go through life without having to apologize for having some of your quirks, but also living, feeling like you don't need to perform or be part of a group in order to matter, that your value just comes from you just enjoying being yourself.
Sure.
I want to talk about a turning point in your narrative. we've talked a lot about some of your educational journey and your successes and failures.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a specific point in like your story up to now that you feel kind of changed your journey? Whether it's, I don't want to say to the worst, because I feel like where you are now is where you are now. It's not bad. It's not good. There's no really an adjective to put it. It's just where you are. Is there a moment that you can define as that turning point?
Oh, I recently had, it's interesting. It's actually quite recent. Had what I thought was a failure. But it pushed me to reset, and to sort of get really comfortable in the work in front of me. So it was sort of moving on to something else. And so for the first, not the first time, but it was a reminder of, you don't have to keep doing, and not just doing. My idea has been to always do better, find better, get better, both within my own both personal and professional development. And for the first time, this door, which I thought was going to be open and I would be taking the next step, actually remained shut for another reason that was completely a surprise to me, or something I didn't expect. But irrespective of that, it was really interesting that, okay, I took maybe a good 10 days to like feel sorry for myself.
You need it sometimes.
Much longer than much longer than I had expected. And then after I got sick of that, and I thought, okay, I woke up one morning, I'm like, nope, I'm going to, whatever is right in front of me, I'm going to give that my absolute focus, and give it everything I've got. And sometimes it's not about doing better somewhere else. It's about being very comfortable in the mud, in what you think doesn't work, but also taking a sort of a step back. And that has been, I'm within at least my own professional work, something that I've taken forward. And what's wild about that was the result of something that I would never have expected happening, which was creativity.
Yeah.
And coming up with ideas that I never had before because I was too busy trying to get to the next best thing. Right?
Yeah. It's this obsession with growth and evolving and, pushing. And I think creativity is this beautiful thing where we could learn to just be patient with where we are and kind of just feel the moment and experience it. I also want to talk a little bit about motherhood, which is a subject you've kind of written about. One of your TEDx talks was about motherhood. Yeah. Can we dive into that?
Do you want to dive into motherhood?
Yeah, I do.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Where do we start? Being a mom has been the greatest honor of my life, the greatest job. And I know that sounds so cliche, but it actually is. And it really is in many ways the most unthankful job you'll ever get, ever. What's the reward? I think others that have more maternal instincts than I would say the reward is, your child being successful or your child giving. For me, it's been something that actually my daughter is my greatest teacher. She's nothing like me. She was nothing like me as a child, in the sense that she is born to lead. She goes to the beat of her own drum. There's things that she'll share with me, or ideas that she's had, or observations that have just left me speechless, because she does read the room, and she is sensitive. She's a sensitive soul, and she's an old soul. And And so there's been a lot of learning from that. In terms of motherhood as a whole, I think one of the things that shocked me is that it takes time to find your community of moms.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of moms out there. I've had some really interesting discussions around that. It's not as instinctive as we are all told, and there is no handbook because every child is different. And even if you are lucky enough to have multiple children, neither one is the same. So you learn to also parent very differently. I think in many ways I'm, going and kind of doing a deep dive that in society we failed women when we failed mothers. I think that has been, and as I understand now my own mother's sort of challenges and struggles, and that one of the things that I don't want to say learned about motherhood because you don't quite learn. It's more like baptism by fire, but it's that you won't necessarily understand your own parents until you've had your own children. And especially when I say parents, I mean a specific kind of parent. So a diaspora parent, an immigrant parent, a refugee parent, where their traumas make more sense, not just make more sense, but you understand them better. You understand that they are human beings and they come with all sorts of challenges and issues and hang-ups that, made them who they were and made sense in their parenting, which doesn't necessarily make sense in yours. And I think for me, the biggest kind of not experience, let's say, has been to stop the intergenerational trauma of my mom and her mom and my daughter and me. And there's moments where I catch myself sounding like my mom, which is just that sort of intergenerational trauma coming out. But it will, I can talk about all aspects of motherhood, but for me, I'm just diving into the intergenerational piece where, it ends with us. So it will end with my daughter and I, that intergenerational.
So what is the relationship she has then with the 1974 conflict?
My daughter.
Yeah.
What's interesting, we haven't really spoken to her in those terms, but obviously she's living here and she sees those structures and systems and in place. My sibling observed that I am raising her very much as a like a Canadian kid, living in another country. But she is very much a kid of worlds, right? She's she's not a third culture kid because she's been born here, but she's being raised as a Greek Cypriot, Canadian, German, or whatever, but which also makes her dynamic and things like language and variety of cultures and diversities kind of come out of that. And it can be very interesting, and it's also very funny. There's a humor in that and how we all engage in different languages in our home and how we address each other, how we speak to each other, and also where the dominant culture or language resides versus the non-dominant or the less spoken. But my hope for her and what I try to remind her is that, it again, maybe a bit cliche to say, but, we are all here just trying to do a little bit better until it's time to leave, until it's our time to leave it. And, just be kind. And of course, we're going to have more complicated questions, especially now, but also in the future.
I want to talk just before we move on about motherhood and like your professional life and the power dynamics you've experienced in that. I mean, you work in a space that works with gender.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume that there would be a lot more, I don't want to say leniency, I think that is the wrong word, but there's a lot more compassion when it comes to, and compassion and empathy. I don't, the right word is just not coming. There is an understanding of women's experience, and especially women who are mothers within a professional setting. What have your experiences been working as a professional woman, but also balancing being a mother and being a human being and who has other interests besides
for sure
the home?
I have to say I am very lucky to have a really strong team of women that have chosen some have chosen to be mothers and coming from all various backgrounds, and also their children are from different ages as well. So they've gone through different chapters or different phases. And it's been really interesting, especially from, at least I've learned especially over the years professionally, speaking to women that are in their mid 50s to 60s, saying to me, like, your professional life is just getting started. I've been told to spend less time working and more time with my daughter, which has been an interesting sort of suggestion or feedback. Others saying the opposite, so I think that it's interesting. You hear sort of all sorts of, lived experiences, but also advice. I think professionally for me, the challenge has been to juggle, of course, like all mothers do, that in unpaid care work, right? That invisible labor, the time difference with my meetings, which are usually the time that she's home, making time for her, but also limiting screen time, which is like the bane of my existence now, like the challenges of that. Is it not too much screen time because it's going to increase anxiety, but then you have a meeting, but and this and that and the other. But also one of the things that I have to say, it's been sort of very much so since post-COVID, has been, so my daughter will interrupt a meeting, even though she knows, or she'll just come by and say hi in a video. I won't tell her off. I won't tell her to leave. She'll come in. This is what I do. I refuse to live as if I don't have, to work as if I don't have children, and then parent as if I don't have a job. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, whereas I think men may get away with a little bit more of that. I'm always convinced when my husband has to go on a trip that it always falls somehow on a time where our daughter is on half term or she's off or it's whatever's going on. And I keep thinking, I'm like, no woman would have made that decision or the length of the time that these meetings will take or whatever it is. And I just think that that there's certain tight kind of leadership that I'm very grateful for with my own employer, who is who very much understands sort of the power dynamics and systems involved when it comes to being a mother and also being a professional in a very very intensive role and environment.
What are the values that you live by?
Oh, well, as of late, I've been having a reckoning with, and especially as a mom, around accountability and transparency, and also recognizing that my moral compass will not be like other people's moral compass. And it doesn't mean that it's not okay. It's just not the same. And I'm trying to be respectful of that, right? But my moral compass guides me into into the way I interact with people, the way I listen, the way I engage, my intention. Apologizing, I would rather be kind than right. I would rather apologize, ask. There's two steps to an apology. I'm sorry, and how can I make it better? And that for me is really important. And within those particular values and being honest, which I'm told is not always a good thing, but here we are,
What kind of future are you building for Cyprus?
What kind of future am I building for the island?
And what kind of future do you hope
do I
for?
imagine? Yeah. So I imagine a Cyprus where, and it's really difficult right now, especially with what's happening around us. I think I'm partly a Cyprus that climate resilience and climate shocks and climate change are absolute priority. That can coexist with intersectionality in the way we engage with each other. I know that those pieces are very challenging for some and for others, despite ideology. I think that's the key for me, is despite ideology or politics, that we are all in it together. And that's sort of at least for me, something that I've been thinking the last couple of days within the current crisis, is that we are really in it together. And I don't want to not do it without all of the various types or diversities that are existing. I wish the island would embrace its complexity more, rather than being scared of it. So we're always looking for one model, one solution, but there may be many, and there may be models of inclusiveness and belonging, rather than, things that have to be based on being conditional. I know these are sort of abstract terms, and folks might be wondering, what are you really talking about? I think one of the things I'd say is that there are so many strengths. I've met so many kinds of folks here, and so many different people and diverse, backgrounds and interesting stories. And even if they are coming from a monolithic culture or identify as one culture, one language, or what have you, what has been really interesting to me, and the takeaway, is that there is still diversity in that oneness, or in that so-called monolithic ideology. And there are nuances that are very different and diverse. And I wish that we could embrace those more, and embrace those nuances, because that's what will bring folks together. But for me, the biggest takeaway, and especially right now, is that we're in it together.
Yeah. And then my last question is, what message would you like to send to the young woman embarking on a future career, or just looking at the world, at Cyprus that is now? What message of hope would you like to leave them with?
Well, there's so much further ahead than I could have ever been or imagined. There are young women here that have blown me away, have inspired me, that, I've been very commonly, I've been told quite more often than I would like that, you're so young. When you get to my age, I don't see that. I'm very happy in the ages that I'm in, or that, the period that I'm in, the age that I am, etc. And when I look at young women, I don't say, oh, well, when you get older, no, you are doing great. And have the audacity of an old white man, and go forth, because there are so many incredible things coming out of young women, whether they're, women business owners or whether they're business owners, whether they're in the health system, whether they choose to be in the military. And I've met some in the gym that have are complete inspiration. Those that are like yourself that have been like so inspiring and have so many messages of hope. I don't think young women are looking to me for hope. I think all I can say is to take that audacity and run with it. And if one door, things will come and go in your life, but to know that there are no failures or successes. It's only what is, it's only what happens, and it happens for you. And life will be unscripted. And also getting into the right university or the right college, or you thought you were going to go one way and you did a detour the other, that's okay too. You don't necessarily, there is no right. It's just you and your choices. And if you're in a privileged position to be able to have more control over your choices, that's amazing. Go for it. And also if you are in a position of privilege, to be very much aware of that and ask yourself, how can I serve? How can I be of service?
Beautiful. Thank you, Sophia.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Of course.